When I saw my husband flipping through my phone, my heart skipped a beat, not from fear of being caught, but from the thought that he might see those messages. The ones I had forgotten to delete. I reached out to snatch the phone from his hands, but he pulled it back effortlessly, his eyes locked on the glowing screen. I watched his face shift, expression by expression, as he read line after line, and I felt my life crumble in mere seconds. Yes, now he would learn the truth. But not the whole truth. His fingers trembled slightly as he scrolled further, and I knew, soon he would come across that single message, the one that would destroy everything. The one that explained it all, or maybe only made it more confusing. My phone suddenly buzzed in his hands, and a new notification appeared. I saw the color drain from his face when he read the sender's name. He froze. He didn't even blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, a habit I had since childhood when I got nervous. My nerves tangled with the terror of realizing what I had done. His breathing quickened. I could hear it even across the 2 meters that separated us. This was exactly what I feared the most. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake that changed absolutely everything forever. And now, I don't know what to do. But let me tell you how it all really happened. Before I share the secret I've been so carefully hiding all this time, tell me this, have you ever had a secret you tried to keep with all your strength, only for it to slip through your fingers in the end? I used to think I had the kind of marriage people envied, steady, unshaken, the kind that looked safe from the outside. And in many ways, it was. We had routines that felt like anchors, mornings with him at the table, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, evenings where the television filled the silences we no longer bothered to fill with conversation. Safe, yes. But safe has a way of quietly turning into stagnant. I didn't notice it at first. It was the little things that started to sting, the way he'd forget to ask about my day, or how his eyes never lifted from his screen when I walked into the room. The touch on my back when he passed me in the kitchen became more like a reflex than a gesture of affection. And though I told myself we were just comfortable, deep down I began to feel invisible. It was my friend who first mentioned the new fitness studio that had opened nearby. We were at lunch, and she waved her fork toward me. "You should try it," she said. "It's good for the body, and for the mind. Shakes things up." At the time, I laughed it off, but later, that sentence replayed in my head. Shake things up. That night, when my husband went to bed early, I sat at the kitchen table scrolling through their website. The photos were glossy, all these people with determined faces and toned arms, and there was something almost hopeful about it. The idea felt harmless enough, getting out of the house, doing something for myself. I didn't know then how one small decision could be the first domino in a line I wouldn't be able to stop. I signed up the next morning. Walking into that studio for the first time, I felt like a stranger in my own life. The air smelled faintly of rubber mats and disinfectant, and the music thumped in the background, not too loud, but enough to feel it in my chest. There were mirrors everywhere, reflecting back my every step, every hesitation. And then there was him. The trainer wasn't what I'd expected. Younger, maybe in his early 30s, but not in that intimidating, unapproachable way. He smiled easily, like he had all the time in the world, and when he said, "Hi, I'm here to help you," it didn't feel like some script he'd memorized. He looked at me when he spoke, really looked, as if I wasn't just another face in the room. The first session was simple enough. Stretches, light cardio, nothing I couldn't handle. But there was something in the way he explained things, adjusting my posture with a gentle nudge, the light pressure of his hand on my shoulder blade as he said, "Straighten here, not there." It was professional, I told myself. Completely normal. Yet, when I left that day, I couldn't stop replaying it. The sound of his voice, the casual warmth in his eyes, even the faint scent of soap that lingered after he adjusted my stance. It wasn't attraction, not yet. But it was something. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. When I came home, my husband was in the living room, television blaring, his shoes kicked off haphazardly by the door. "How was it?" he asked without looking away from the screen. "Good," I said. And it was true. But the way I said it felt like a secret, though I didn't know why. Over the next week, I found myself looking forward to the workouts in a way that surprised me. It wasn't just about the exercise, it was the ritual of leaving the house, the quiet drive there, the feeling of doing something for me. By the second or third session, I started to notice more. How he remembered the smallest details, like the fact that I preferred stretching first or that my knee ached if we pushed too hard. How he encouraged without making it feel forced, as if he genuinely believed I could do more than I thought. At home, I caught myself glancing at the clock, counting down the hours until I could leave again. I paid more attention to what I wore, choosing leggings that made me feel a little less invisible, tying my hair differently, adding a touch of perfume, though I told myself it was silly. It wasn't about him, I insisted. It was about feeling alive again. But deep down, in the quiet moments when I was honest with myself, I wondered why it mattered that he noticed. One evening, after a long session, I lingered in the studio, pretending to tie my shoes just a little slower. He was talking to another client across the room, but when his eyes flicked over to me and he smiled, just a brief curve of his mouth, it felt like sunlight through a crack in the blinds. I told myself I was imagining it. That this was all in my head. But even then, I knew, something had shifted. And once something shifts, it rarely shifts back. The second session felt different from the first, though nothing in the routine had changed. As I stepped into the familiar gym, the smell of rubber mats mixed with the faint scent of eucalyptus from the diffuser at the reception. The hum of treadmills and the occasional clink of weights created a background soundtrack I was beginning to recognize. I was no longer just a newcomer trying to find her footing. I was someone who looked forward to this time carved out of her otherwise predictable days. He greeted me with the same warm smile, but today his eyes held something more attentive, like he was noticing details I hadn't realized I was showing. When he adjusted my posture during stretches, his hands lingered just a fraction longer. It was subtle, professional enough not to raise suspicion, but intimate enough to send a ripple of awareness through me. Each touch reminded me that I was still capable of eliciting some response, even if it had been a while since anyone had cared to see. We moved through the exercises at a steady pace, and I could feel my muscles working harder than before. But it wasn't the physical exertion that captivated me, it was the way he spoke, his voice calm but firm, encouraging me with precise corrections. "Keep your back straight here," he'd say, his fingers lightly tracing the line of my spine. Those small moments felt charged with something I wasn't ready to name. After the workout, he suggested we grab a coffee nearby. It wasn't part of the plan, but I didn't hesitate. The idea of extending our time together, even casually, was too tempting. We found a quiet table in the corner of the cafe. The low murmur of conversations and the clinking of cups wrapped around us, creating a private bubble. Our conversation drifted away from fitness. He asked about my daily routine, my interests, my thoughts on simple things, like whether I preferred mornings or evenings, how I liked to unwind after a long day. His questions weren't invasive but genuine, as if he wanted to piece together who I really was beyond the surface. I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't expected, surprised by the ease of sharing parts of myself I usually kept guarded. As we talked, our hands occasionally brushed. The contact was fleeting but electric, stirring memories of tenderness I thought were long buried. His gaze held mine steadily, and for a moment, the noise around us faded. Then, without warning, we kissed. It was brief, soft, and left a residue of something indescribable hanging between us. The moment passed, and reality rushed back in. I pulled away, heart pounding, cheeks flushed. neither of us spoke for a few beats, both aware that this crossed an invisible line. I left soon after, the cool evening air hitting my face as I stepped outside, my mind spinning with the weight of what had just happened. Back home, the silence between me and my husband felt heavier. His back was turned as he worked on his laptop, unaware of the storm brewing inside me. I sat alone in the dim living room, replaying the kiss, wondering what it meant and how much of my life was about to change. The kiss lingered in my mind like a song I couldn't stop humming. It wasn't passionate or drawn out, but it was enough to lodge itself in me, a weight pressing in places I hadn't felt in years. By the next morning, the memory of it had woven itself into everything, making coffee, folding laundry, even the way I chose my clothes felt different, like every decision was suddenly under a new kind of light. I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual that morning. Not out of vanity, but curiosity. I studied the lines near my eyes, the faint hollow in my cheeks, the way my hair fell unevenly over my shoulders. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt changed. I applied lipstick, wiped it off, then reapplied it, wondering what exactly I was preparing for. At breakfast, my husband sat at the table, eyes glued to his phone, muttering something about an email from work. He didn't notice my lipstick, didn't notice the slight tremor in my hand when I poured his coffee. Or maybe he did, and just didn't think it mattered enough to say anything. I realized, not for the first time, how little we truly looked at each other anymore. The day dragged on. I tried to busy myself with chores, grocery lists, a load of laundry, reorganizing the spice rack, but my mind kept circling back. The kiss replayed over and over, each iteration bringing a new question. Did he regret it? Did he think I did? Was it just a momentary lapse, or the start of something neither of us fully understood yet? That afternoon, my phone buzzed. A short message from him, "You did really well today," 6 simple words, but they hit harder than they should have. My pulse quickened as I stared at the screen, thumb hovering over the keyboard. I typed and erased responses half a dozen times before settling on something neutral, "Thank you." But even after hitting send, I kept checking my phone, waiting for the next vibration. It wasn't about the words themselves, it was the feeling that someone, somewhere, was thinking about me. By the time the next training session came, I had already chosen my outfit with a deliberateness I didn't want to admit to myself. I told myself I was dressing for comfort, but I knew better. The leggings were slightly more fitted, the top cut just a bit lower, my hair pulled back to show the curve of my neck. Small choices, but intentional ones. When I arrived at the gym, he noticed. I could tell by the way his eyes paused for just a fraction longer before he smiled. The session went on as usual, stretches, movements, his voice steady, but the air between us felt thicker, weighted with the unspoken memory of the kiss. "Straighten here," he said softly at one point, his hand guiding my shoulder back into alignment. His touch was light, professional, but the warmth of his palm lingered long after he'd stepped away. I wanted to ask him about the kiss, to break the tension by naming it, but the words never came. Instead, I found myself talking about ordinary things, how I was sleeping better, how my balance had improved, how the workouts were helping me feel stronger. He listened, nodding, offering encouragement. Yet there were moments when our eyes met and it felt like we were talking about something else entirely. When I got home, the house felt different. My husband was sitting on the couch, watching something on his laptop, and he actually looked up when I walked in. "You've been going a lot lately," he said, not accusing, just observing. "I needed something for myself," I replied. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. He nodded, distracted again by whatever was on his screen, and the conversation ended there. But inside me, the restlessness grew. That evening, I sat alone in the living room, the light from the window casting long shadows across the floor. My phone was on the table, and every few minutes I glanced at it, even when I knew there wouldn't be a new message. It struck me then, not the guilt, not yet, but the realization that something had been set in motion. Something small, maybe, but undeniable. The kiss wasn't just a fleeting accident. It had changed the way I saw myself, the way I saw him, even the way I looked at the life I'd built. I tried to tell myself I could stop thinking about it, that I could close that door as easily as it had opened. But I didn't delete the message from him. And the truth was, I didn't want to. The following week felt heavier than the ones before. Not because of guilt exactly, but because of the awareness that things had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. The kiss was a boundary broken, and now everything else seemed closer to breaking too. Even mundane things felt different, standing at the sink washing dishes, folding laundry, waiting for the kettle to boil. Each quiet moment felt like an empty room echoing with thoughts I didn't want to face. I caught myself thinking about him when I shouldn't. The way his voice softened when he explained an exercise, how his hand steadied my back just enough to guide me. It wasn't only physical, though that awareness lingered, it was the sense of being seen, of someone noticing the smallest parts of me without judgment. He texted me again, this time asking if I'd be willing to try a session outside the gym. Sometimes it helps to learn exercises you can do at home, he wrote. The message was neutral, harmless on the surface, but I felt my chest tighten reading it. I sat with the thought longer than I should have before typing out a simple, sure. The morning of that session, I found myself tidying the house in a frenzy. It wasn't messy to begin with, but I wiped down the counters twice, smoothed the sofa cushions, and rearranged books on the table. I told myself it was because I didn't want him to think I lived in disarray. But deep down, I knew it was about control, controlling what he would see, what version of me I would show him. When he arrived, he carried only a small bag and that same easy smile. There was something disarming about how natural he seemed in my doorway, as though it wasn't unusual for him to be here. Where should we set up? He asked, glancing around. The living room, I said, my voice steadier than my hands. We moved the coffee table aside to make room for the mat. The room, usually quiet and ordinary, felt different with him in it. I noticed the scent of his soap again, faint but familiar, mixing with the smell of freshly cleaned wood floors. He showed me stretches first, slow, deliberate movements. I followed his instructions, each one clear, practical, easy to justify. But there were moments when practicality blurred. When he adjusted the angle of my arm or corrected the tilt of my hips, his touch was firm but gentle, lingering just enough to leave a trace behind. Breathe here, he said, his hand lightly on my shoulder as I exhaled. I told myself it was part of the job. But my heart didn't believe that. Between exercises, we spoke. About the benefits of balance work, about how small corrections could prevent injuries. I nodded, took mental notes, tried to focus on the mechanics of what he was teaching. But the silences between sentences felt louder, like something unsaid hovered in the air. When the session ended, he stayed standing for a moment, as if neither of us wanted to mark the visit as over too quickly. Keep practicing these, he said finally, his tone calm, professional again. I nodded, watching him gather his things. The bag on his shoulder looked out of place in my home, like an anchor for the moment, a reminder that he didn't belong here, not really. When the door closed behind him, the room felt strangely empty. His scent lingered faintly, caught in the fabric of the couch where his hand had rested briefly to steady himself. I sat down on that same couch, staring at the mat still stretched across the floor. My fingers traced the place on my arm where his hand had corrected my posture. It wasn't guilt that consumed me in that moment. It was awareness. Awareness that this wasn't just about workouts anymore. Later that evening, my husband came home. He noticed the coffee table had been moved and asked, almost absently, "What's all this?" "I had a session here today," I said. He just nodded, heading into the kitchen to drop his keys on the counter. The conversation ended before it began, and part of me was relieved. But as I stood there, looking at the mat rolled up and tucked away in the corner, I felt that strange mix of fear and anticipation again, the one I couldn't seem to shake anymore. Something had crossed another line. And lines, once crossed, are hard to redraw. The morning after the home session felt strangely unsettled, as if the walls themselves had been rearranged overnight. I woke up before my husband, lying still and listening to the rhythm of his breathing beside me. He looked peaceful, almost unaware of the storm that had been building inside me for weeks now. That quiet observation brought a pang of guilt, not sharp, but low and steady, like a dull ache that refused to fade. I moved through the house trying to shake it off. The kitchen smelled faintly of the lavender cleaner I'd used obsessively the day before, as though scrubbing the surfaces might erase the imprint of what had happened. But no matter how tidy everything looked, I couldn't erase the memory of him standing in this room, his voice steady, his hands so casually close to mine. The next few days blurred together. I busied myself with errands, with meal prep, with anything to keep my mind occupied. But distraction was only temporary. Every time my phone buzzed, my breath caught, not from fear, but from that inexplicable jolt of anticipation. When his messages came, they were simple, polite, nothing that could be questioned. Did the stretches feel easier today? Or keep up the breathing practice, it helps balance. Yet those small words carried a weight I couldn't explain to anyone else. By the end of the week, he suggested another coffee after a session. Just to go over your progress, he wrote, and I didn't even pause before agreeing. I told myself it wasn't unusual, people met for coffee all the time. But as I got dressed that morning, I caught myself lingering over which blouse to wear, which earrings to put on, whether perfume was too much. My reflection in the mirror seemed to question me, though I didn't answer back. The workout that day was uneventful, but the unspoken tension between us wasn't. Every adjustment, every instruction, felt more loaded now, as though we were both aware of what neither of us dared to say. Afterward, we walked together to the same cafe as before. It was late afternoon, the kind of gray light that makes the world feel muted. The cafe wasn't busy, and we chose a corner table again, away from the few other customers. We talked at first about ordinary things, the exercises, my form, even the weather. But there was a moment, somewhere between sips of coffee, when the conversation shifted. He reached for my hand across the table. It wasn't a bold move, not even deliberate at first, just his fingers brushing mine as he adjusted his cup. But his hand stayed there, warm and steady, and I didn't pull away. I remember looking at our hands, at the way his thumb traced the edge of my knuckle, and feeling an ache so familiar it startled me. That quiet ache of being wanted, of being noticed, not for the errands I ran or the dinners I cooked, but for me. When I looked up, his gaze met mine without hesitation. And before I could think, before I could even weigh the cost, we kissed. We kissed, and for that brief moment, the world narrowed down to just that, his hand holding mine, the taste of coffee between us, the quiet hum of the cafe fading into nothing. When the kiss broke, I felt my breath catch. Neither of us spoke right away. The silence wasn't awkward, but it was heavy, like something new had been set in motion, something neither of us could name yet. I pulled my hand back slowly, though part of me didn't want to. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, part softness, part restraint. We finished our drinks in near silence, both of us aware that something had shifted again. On the walk back to my car, I tried to sort through the jumble of thoughts in my head. The rational side of me screamed for distance, for clarity, for the line to be drawn again. But the other part, the part that had felt invisible for so long, clung to the spark he had lit. When I got home, I found my husband at the dining table, scrolling through his laptop. He glanced up when I entered, and for a fleeting second I worried the guilt was written all over me. "You're home late," he said simply. "Traffic," I replied, the lie leaving my mouth too easily. He nodded and went back to his screen. The conversation ended there. But as I stood in the hallway, coat still in my hand, I felt the weight of the kiss pressing on me, not as shame, not entirely, but as a truth I could no longer ignore. The drive home after that second kiss was quiet, but not in the usual, soothing way that silence sometimes is. It was the kind of quiet that pressed against my ribs and made my thoughts too loud. My hands rested on the steering wheel, steady enough to keep me on the road, but my mind wasn't really in the car, it was still at that table in the corner of the cafe, replaying that single moment. By the time I reached the house, the sky had darkened into a soft, grayish blue, and the porch light cast long shadows across the steps. I sat in the car for a few seconds before going inside, trying to arrange my face into something neutral. My husband was in the living room, his laptop balanced on his knees, the glow of the screen painting his face. He looked up briefly and said, "Hey," before turning back to whatever held his attention. That brief acknowledgement, the simplicity of it, felt heavier than I expected. Over the next few days, life moved forward in its usual rhythm, but my own rhythm was off. I went through my tasks, grocery shopping, laundry, cooking dinner, but all of it felt like I was moving on autopilot. At odd moments, my phone would buzz with his messages. They were short, polite, almost deliberately careful. "How's the balance exercise going?" Or "Don't forget to stretch before bed tonight, it'll help." I stared at those messages longer than I should have, rereading them, noticing every word choice. It wasn't just about what he said, it was about the fact that he was thinking of me in those small, deliberate ways. That someone was, for lack of a better word, paying attention. By the end of the week, he suggested we take a drive together. "Just a change of scenery," he wrote. "Helps keep the body and mind loose." The wording was innocent, but the meaning felt anything but. I hesitated for a few moments, staring at the blinking cursor on my phone. And then I typed, "Okay." When the evening came, I found myself waiting by the window longer than necessary, watching for headlights. I told myself it was just a drive, nothing more. But as I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, my heart betrayed me, beating faster than the situation warranted. The car ride was quiet at first. The city slipped past us, the street lights casting brief pools of light over the dashboard. He played music softly, something unobtrusive, the kind of instrumental track that fills silence without demanding attention. I stared out the window, watching the blur of familiar streets give way to quieter, emptier roads. After a while, he spoke, not about us, not about the kiss, but about stretches and posture, about his own training, about how he'd gotten into this line of work. His voice was calm, steady, grounding. I answered when I needed to, but mostly I listened, letting his words fill the car like a low hum. Eventually, we pulled over on a quiet street. It wasn't planned, not exactly, but it felt natural in that moment. The engine idled for a while before he turned it off, and the sudden stillness made the air between us feel denser. We didn't look at each other right away. I kept my eyes on the windshield, tracing the faint reflection of streetlights. But I was aware of him, acutely aware, the way you are when someone's presence fills a space more than their body does. He shifted slightly in his seat, and for a moment I thought he might say something, name the tension that neither of us had dared to name. But he didn't. And somehow, that unspoken choice carried as much weight as words would have. I felt my own breath deepen, more conscious, almost deliberate. My hand rested on my lap, and I wondered if he noticed the way my fingers fidgeted with the hem of my jacket. Eventually, he reached over, not boldly, but simply, and adjusted the air vent between us. That small movement made his hand brush against mine. Just a fraction of contact, a simple brush of skin, but it was enough to send a current through me. I didn't pull away. The moment hung there, suspended, and though nothing more happened, it didn't need to. The closeness said enough. The drive back was just as quiet, but the silence felt different now, not empty, not exactly full, but stretched, like something waiting to be defined. When I stepped back into the house, the familiar smell of dinner leftovers and coffee mugs on the counter met me, grounding me. My husband was watching something on TV, the volume low. "You're back," he said without looking away from the screen. "I went for a drive," I replied, setting my jacket on the chair. He nodded, distracted, and the moment passed. But as I stood in the hallway, I felt the awareness settle in again, not guilt, not quite, but the understanding that the line I'd been tiptoeing along had nearly disappeared. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted it back. The morning after the drive, I woke to the quiet hum of the house, but my body felt heavy, as if it already knew something I hadn't allowed myself to admit. I stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours, though the clock told me it was minutes, the same dull question circling in my head, how much further can this go, I moved through the day the way you walk through water, everything slow, muted, but dense with effort. I ran errands, folded towels, answered small questions from my husband about groceries and bills, but all of it was done in fragments of thought. There was an invisible weight in my chest, like the before of a confession. Later that evening, my phone buzzed. His name lit up the screen, simple and familiar now, almost comfortable. "I'm coming by to drop something off, just a training plan for next week," the message read. I stared at the words longer than I should have. Rationally, it was harmless. But reason wasn't what ruled my pulse in that moment. When the doorbell rang, it felt louder than usual. I opened the door, and there he was, standing with that same unhurried ease, holding a folded sheet of paper in his hand. The house was quiet, my husband out for a late meeting, the kind of absence that seemed to stretch the walls wider. He stepped inside, his bag slung casually over his shoulder, the paper left forgotten on the entryway table. We moved to the living room without discussion, as if the decision had been made long before either of us walked there. There was no pretense of a session this time, no talk of stretches or breathing techniques. The air between us was different now, no longer something we could excuse as accidental. We sat down on the couch, at first side by side, a polite distance between us. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the soft creak of the wood floor beneath us. Small, ordinary sounds, made louder by the silence that wrapped around us. He turned slightly toward me, his knee brushing mine. That small touch, almost nothing, sent a sharp awareness through me. I felt the space between us collapse, not literally, but in the way a thought becomes action when neither person stops it. There weren't words. None were needed, and none would have been enough. He leaned closer, slow enough for me to feel every inch of what was about to happen, but not slow enough for me to stop it. That night, we spent the night together. The house felt unfamiliar the next morning, even though nothing about it had changed. The same couch, the same kitchen chairs, the same pictures on the wall, but the air felt thicker, the silence different, like it knew what had happened. I stood by the sink, hands wrapped around a coffee mug, staring out the window. My husband's car wasn't in the driveway yet, he hadn't come home the night before, claiming an early meeting that bled into an overnight stay near his office. That excuse, so ordinary, was now the only reason the night had been possible. I should have felt guilt clawing at me. And there was guilt, somewhere in me, but it was tangled with something else. Something that felt disturbingly like relief. It wasn't that the world had righted itself. It was that a part of me that had been silent for so long had finally been acknowledged, and now it couldn't be silenced again. When the door finally closed behind him that morning, the quiet that followed felt like a verdict. I stood in it, coffee going cold in my hands, unsure if what I felt was the start of regret or the inability to regret it all. The hours after he left that morning stretched in ways I couldn't quite measure. I moved around the house without really seeing it, wiping counters that were already clean, rearranging things on shelves, folding and refolding the same dish towel. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was loaded, like the pause before something inevitable. At first, I thought I would feel consumed by shame. That was what I had expected, what I told myself I deserved. But the truth was more complicated. Shame was there, yes, simmering beneath the surface, but tangled with it was an almost disorienting sense of release, as if something that had been locked inside me for years had finally spilled out. I stood by the window for a long time, looking out at the same street I'd looked at every day, yet it felt like I was seeing it from a different life. The neighbors' cars were parked in their usual spots, the mail truck went by at the same hour, and still, everything seemed slightly altered. The world had kept turning, even though mine had shifted overnight. I made coffee and couldn't bring myself to drink it. The mug sat cooling on the counter as I leaned against the sink, my mind looping through fragments of the night before, the sound of his voice in the quiet room, the way he'd looked at me without hesitation, the way I hadn't hesitated either. By midday, my phone rang. I saw my husband's name on the screen, and a chill threaded through me before I answered. He said he was coming home later than planned, his voice casual but not entirely so. "One of my friends mentioned seeing you the other day," he added, almost offhandedly. "You were at a cafe?" I froze for a split second, gripping the edge of the counter. "Yes," I said, keeping my tone even. "After a session." "Just coffee." There was a pause, too short to be an accusation, too long to be nothing. "All right," he said finally. "Just checking in." When the call ended, my hand stayed on the counter, steadying myself even though I hadn't moved. The rest of the afternoon passed in pieces. Every time my phone buzzed, my stomach knotted, half expecting another question, another hint that something was unraveling. But the messages were mundane, work reminders, a note from a neighbor about trash bins. Nothing explosive. Still, the tension didn't ease. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and barely recognized the look in my own eyes. It wasn't just guilt staring back, it was the weight of knowing I'd crossed into a place I couldn't return from, and now I had to live in it. By evening, the house felt unbearably still. I turned on the television just to fill the air, but the noise only made the silence underneath it more obvious. I thought about texting him, about saying something, anything, that might steady me. But what would I say? There were no words that didn't feel too much or not enough. When my husband finally came home, he was quieter than usual. Not cold, not angry, just quiet. He hung up his coat, set his keys in the bowl by the door, and sat at the table. "Long day?" I asked, my voice casual, though my pulse was anything but. He nodded, offering little else. We sat across from each other for a few moments, the weight of everything unspoken pressing harder than any argument could have. After he went to bed, I stayed in the kitchen, sitting in the half-dark. I stared at my hands on the table, fingers tracing invisible patterns on the wood. For the first time, I wondered not just how far this could go, but how much longer I could carry the weight of both lives, one that looked steady from the outside, and one that had already begun to crack it from within. The days after that phone call blurred together in a strange, heavy way, like pages sticking together in a book. Nothing explosive happened. There were no confrontations, no shouting, no slammed doors. But the quiet itself had weight, and it pressed on me constantly, even in the simplest tasks, emptying the dishwasher, folding laundry, setting the table for dinner. I saw him the trainer less often now, but each meeting felt sharper somehow, as if the pauses in between only made the moments we did share more fraught. We didn't talk about that night. We didn't name it, didn't dissect it. Maybe because speaking about it would make it more real, or maybe because words would demand decisions we weren't ready to make. Still, the undercurrent was there, every time. I started noticing my husband's behavior in a new way. He wasn't suspicious, not exactly, but he was more present. More watchful. He asked more questions about my day, though not in a demanding tone. How was your session? Who was there? What time did you leave? Each question sounded casual, but the accumulation made me tense. One evening, he suggested we take a weekend trip together. Just us, he said, almost carefully. Like we used to. I agreed. I didn't hesitate, because hesitation might have sounded like guilt. But the truth was, the idea of that trip filled me with a strange mix of dread and longing. We went. We stayed in a small, quiet place by the water, a place we'd visited before years ago. The familiarity of it should have been comforting, but it wasn't, not entirely. I found myself studying the way we moved around each other, how we spoke in measured tones about restaurants and weather, about things that didn't matter. At night, I lay awake in the dark, the sound of the waves faint outside the window, and wondered if he could feel the distance between us, the invisible gap that had opened and wouldn't close. When we returned home, I felt more tired than before we left. The trip hadn't erased anything, it had only made the cracks more visible. I saw the trainer again a few days later. The session was short, but charged. He asked how the weekend had been, and I gave him a neutral answer, nothing revealing. But our eyes met for just a moment longer than was safe, and that said enough. By then, I could feel something changing in him too. He was careful, but I sensed his uncertainty, the way he checked his words, the way his hands hesitated slightly before adjusting my posture. On the drive home, I thought about everything we weren't saying. The night we weren't naming. The choices we hadn't made but had already started to live with. At home, my husband greeted me with a softness that almost felt like an apology for something unspoken. But instead of easing me, it made me feel like I was wearing someone else's life. That evening, I stood in the kitchen staring at a sink full of dishes, my hands submerged in warm, soapy water, and felt a hollow space opening inside me. I realized then that it wasn't just about what I'd done. It was about the fact that I couldn't go back, not to who I'd been, not to the version of our marriage that existed before any of this began. And maybe, I thought, I didn't even want to. The final unraveling wasn't loud or sudden. There was no dramatic confrontation, no accusations hurled across a room, no breaking of plates or tears on the staircase. It happened slowly, in the soft erosion of trust, in the accumulation of silences, in the hollow spaces where conversation used to be. If anyone had walked into our house in those last weeks, they might have seen a marriage still intact, two people sharing meals, asking about each other's day, tending to the routines that had once seemed unbreakable. But if they'd looked closer, they would have seen the distance in our eyes, the way our hands never quite found each other's across the table anymore. One morning, as I sat by the window, a pale sunlight poured over the kitchen tiles. I watched the shadows shift and felt an odd sense of calm, as though something inside me had already settled into a new reality. My husband entered, moving quietly, making coffee with the same practiced gestures. He glanced at me, not with suspicion, but with a kind of resignation, as if he, too, understood that something essential had changed and wasn't coming back. He sat across from me and let the silence linger. I wanted to say something, maybe to apologize, maybe to explain, but every possible sentence felt pointless. Instead, I watched his face, searching for anger or hurt, but finding mostly fatigue. Our eyes met, and for a moment, I remembered all the years we had shared, the history that still lived in every corner of this house. But memory alone wasn't enough to bridge what had been lost. Later that day, I received no message from the trainer. No check-ins, no reminders about stretching or balance, no invitations for coffee. The absence felt abrupt and final, more conclusive than any conversation could have been. I tried not to dwell on it, but I found myself glancing at my phone throughout the day, waiting for a message I knew wouldn't come. That evening, my husband and I prepared dinner together. The smallness of the task, the chopping of vegetables, the scraping of chairs on the floor, felt heavy with meaning. I noticed the lines on his hands, the way he moved around the kitchen, and I wondered if he was making a mental list of everything he wanted to say but wouldn't. I knew I was. We ate in near silence, the clink of silverware louder than our words. Afterward, he suggested a walk, and we stepped outside into the cool dusk. The streetlights flickered on, one by one, casting pools of yellow on the sidewalk. We walked slowly, not holding hands, not talking much. At one point, he stopped and turned to me. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly. The question sat between us for a long moment. I considered lying, considered giving him the answer I thought he wanted. But the truth was, I didn't know. I shook my head, barely, and he nodded as if he understood. We finished the walk and returned home, each lost in our own thoughts. That night, I stood by the window long after he had gone to bed, watching the empty street below. The house was silent, but not peaceful. I thought about everything that had happened, the small choices, the slow drift, the moments I could never take back. I wondered if I would ever be able to explain, to myself or to anyone else, how I ended up here. When I finally went to bed, I lay awake for hours, listening to the steady rhythm of my husband's breathing. I realized that, for all the chaos and longing, all the guilt and relief, I was now left with only myself and the consequences of my choices. The life I had known was gone, and in its place was something quieter, less certain, but, at least for now, real. And that, I suppose, is how endings usually arrive. Not with a storm, but with a hush that settles after the noise. I closed my eyes and let the hush fill the space where certainty used to live, unsure of what would come next, but certain that the past could not be undone.